political commentator Rob Double is with us. Good to see you, Rob. Let's get into that freedom of speech issue. I mean, it comes around this subject, but this is accelerated and given booster rockets, I suppose, by the credibility and authenticity of the author, who's really put a lot of thought into trying to get to the bottom of what the hell's going on.
Absolutely. And I think what is stark about this is that we have known for years, we've had reports about MPs being subject to harassment, particularly female MPs, particularly female journalists as well. I remember very vividly Laura Coombsberg having to be escorted around a conference. I think it was the Labour conference a few years back with a bodyguard. But what this report really says is just how pervasive this kind of harassment and censorship is getting into society, into everyday people's lives, people like teachers and journalists, councillors, lower level of politics, local level of politics. And that is, dangerous. And it's kind of the way that's subtly happened over the years. Now, really, it's kind of being called out in this very, very public way.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, isn't it? Because some people will always cross a line. Now, when you cross a line, you might get into criminality, whether it's racism or something like that. But in so many areas, it's usually just a difference of opinion. It's interesting that a lot of sportswomen had said, they feel uncomfortable talking about transgender athletes in their sport. And, I mean, this subject comes up all the time. And there are some very vocal voices, Sharon Davis and people like that, who speak out on this issue. But many are scared to speak out because they think if I do, I'll lose the sponsorships, I'll lose coverage, I won't be selected. Now, that's a curious one, isn't it? Because it's not illegal to say that you have a question mark over transgender athletes, but it's seen as uncomfortable. And then the intimidation, and then the pile-on, and then you find out that you've got people wanting to kill you because you have a different belief to them.
Absolutely. And you've got, 75% of people feel they can't speak their mind. That is one of the top line facts coming out from this report. I mean, I think when it comes to democracy and the impact of democracy, I think we have to be a little bit careful about this, because the great thing about the way we do democracy in the UK, and as indeed across the world, is that it's a secret ballot, which means it doesn't matter what you say or what you don't say in public opinion. When you get into the ballot box, no one knows how you vote. And so I think in that sense, democracy is still very much protected. People can vote without fear of repercussions. It's more about how it's set in public, how it's set in society. If no one who feels they have a slight nuanced opinion, feels they can't speak out, it leaves a void. And what fills the void? The people who are happy to scream and shout about it, who might have more extreme opinions. And then all of a sudden, the whole debate around an issue just becomes a very divisive sort of societal narrative of great sort of division, when perhaps it's just because people who have a more nuanced view don't feel they can speak.
I mean, we mentioned, and it was mentioned in the Dame Sara's report, that the Batley school teacher, I mean, what happened to this guy was absolutely horrendous. And as far as we talked about it a lot when nobody was really talking about it. And it was curious because it seemed to have been given a free pass. I mean, there were people outside the school almost calling for the blood of this man. The guy's in hiding. His identity had to be changed because he did something that upset some people. And it's something he'd done before in the classroom as well. I think 3 or 4 times before he'd repeated this particular exercise. And nothing's happened. I mean, despite all of that, the local MP, Kim Ledbetter, I mean, if you want to look at levels of uselessness with your local political representatives, she's in another part. She's in another part of the spectrum. She said nothing at all.
The report goes further than that, though, because it says it's not just about the MP, it's about the local authorities as well. It's about the police, how they handled it. It's how the school, they handled it. I mean, the school themselves have pushed back quite heavily on this report, saying they don't recognise a lot of what's been described. But clearly, the fact that a teacher had to go into hiding as a result of something being taught in the context of a blasphemy, as the subject of blasphemy, I think there's something very concerning about that. One of the things in the report, which is kind of getting through in the news today, is that there is a recommendation that protests be banned 150 metres from schools, so that you keep that away from the school gates. And it'll be interesting to see. We haven't really heard much from the government. I haven't heard much from the government about it yet. It'll be interesting to see if any of these recommendations actually get taken forward.
Yeah, I've got a funny feeling that this will probably end up going nowhere, because I don't think it's going to be part of the government's urgent business. By the time, if they did want to make it their urgent business, they're likely to be out of power anyway in X amount of months' time. So this will fall into the lap of Keir Starmer, who will put on his size 9s and kick it firmly into the long grass.
Quite possibly. I mean, I think it's one of those ones, is how do you enforce, because the report identifies the laws around harassment are the problem here. They're not being enforced. They're not being enforced consistently. And the second thing is behaviours, how people are behaving when they're confronted with things they don't like, they don't agree with, or they find offensive. Now, the legal structure around harassment, perhaps you can deal with, you know, in a more straightforward way. But how do you deal with policing people's behaviours? You know, you shouldn't be reacting like that just because you disagree with someone.
Well, that's exactly it.
But who and where is the expectation there, and who's going to enforce that? Are we going to seriously put a highly subjective and nuanced, question mark on enforcing behaviours to individual police officers who have to, on the ground, try and have a consistent way of dealing with, people? It's going to cause a huge amount of problems around that, because there's going to be inconsistencies. When there's inconsistencies, there's going to be resentments. There's going to be feelings of being persecuted or censored.
But then you get into what is sort of hate speech and all the rest of it. Because if you say something the transphobic issue is an obvious, very much a live issue, an ongoing subject. And I've always made the point that there's there's more than one subject going on here. The gender critical group, as it's called. You can be gender critical. You can say that, I should not have a right to just stick a frock on and walk into a women's toilet. And I don't think anybody should be disagreeing with that. But that's very different to somebody who's lived their life for 30, 40 years as a woman, physically has surgically changed to a woman. Their argument, I think, might be slightly different to a man who just gets a kick out of sticking a dress on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, of course, if you criticise one, are you criticising both? Is it hate speech? If it's hate speech, people often say, well, you wouldn't talk about gay people like this. That's how they used to talk about gay people. They're dangerous. You can't put them anywhere near kids, etc., because they're gay and they might do something. So you get into this kind of double thing. What's hate speech? What is against the law? What is freedom of speech?
It's extremely difficult, and I think it's not something that I think has ever been resolved. And the problem is that when you don't have issues like this being resolved, you're going to get instances like this where a teacher who's done something he's done many times before suddenly is subject to a torrent of abuse and harassment, which causes them to go into hiding. It does need to be solved, but I think, to be honest, I don't have the answer to how you can actually police that or regulate that.
I don't know how you do it, particularly with social media. I was, a couple of months ago, me along with others, I was libelled by an unemployed journalist on the whole transgender issue over things I never said. But of course, then, once it gets out there, other people pile in who don't know anything about me or the work I do. They pile in, and then it starts to get really nasty. And before you realise it, there's 200,000 people have seen a post, drawn a conclusion, and want your blood. And you think, wow. I mean, that's quite dangerous stuff.
I think it's particularly...
That's just on little old Twitter.
And I think that's particularly dangerous. I mean, we're going to talk about the, Kate Middleton and what happened with her in Trolls, in a second. But, the idea that you are blamed if there is a story that's come out, or that there is a wave of hatred going towards you because of something you allegedly said or didn't say, or in Princess of Wales' case, was she ill? Was she not ill? It's your fault. You left too much of a void for which all these conspiracy theories came around. There's this bizarre situation where you are almost blamed for creating a situation
because you
haven't said something.
You didn't announce your very serious cancer diagnosis to the world on our clock when we wanted it announced. So therefore, we're going to make some stuff up about it.
What did you expect? You must, surely this was going to happen.
Beyond, yeah, indeed, but it's beyond belief. That I spent yesterday morning. There I was, a nice Sunday morning coffee, bit of a brioche. I live in Sevenoaks. You have to have a brioche with your coffee. It's the law. And I found myself an hour and 10 minutes later still reading some of the garbage that's been written about the people analysing the video. Nothing's moving in the video. It's CGI. It's green screen. It's artificial intelligence. It's not really her. Her ring's disappeared. This is, we're being lied to. Some people, of course, are making mischief. Other people tend to believe this guff. And that's where we're at. The trolls are still coming for Kate.
Yeah, and it seems to still be going on. And I think what I think is particularly difficult is that, clearly if someone's had major surgery, we know they've had major surgery, and there clearly has not been a lot put forward. I think people can read between the lines. Clearly there might be a complication there. And as a human being, if you've had a medical complication that probably is serious, you probably want a bit of time. As the former spokesperson for the Prince and Princess of Wales said on the weekend, time.
I mean, of course. And I think, my thought was that it probably is something more serious. I think it would have been good PR for the palace to maybe elaborate on that a bit. However, it hasn't stopped the trolls because they're still out there. Very briefly, Rob, if we can. Quick word on China, the China cyber attack. It's a curious relationship we have with the Chinese. Nobody wants to cut ties with the biggest economy on the planet. But simultaneously, these are the guys that are having a right old snoop.
Exactly. So I think the big thing today is that the government or ministers have said China was responsible and accused them for the malign attack on the Electoral Commission. So one of our most important democratic institutions, the leaking of huge amounts of data on personal data from people who are voters on the electoral register. This is going to expose and has exposed the big debate within the Conservative Party and division in the Conservative Party of how you deal with China. You've had Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, former Conservative leader, saying we need to reset our relationship with China. Very difficult for someone like Lord Cameron, current Foreign Secretary, who during his time as Prime Minister wanted the golden age of relations with China, wanted business to be thriving between us two. So I'd be watching that kind of further debate in the Conservative Party in the next few hours.
We will watch with interest. Rob, good to see you. Thank you
very much.
Rob Double with us here on TalkTV.